Good morning. Would you like to take your seats, please? And could the shooters move out of the way, please? So, good morning. My name's Jonathan Lynn. I'm the Head of Communications at the IPCC, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this press conference to present the summary for policymakers of Working Group 1. It's been a long couple of nights here, but we're very pleased that we're able to start the press conference on time. We're going to have statements from the people on the podium, and also going to be joined by the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme in Nairobi, Mr. Achim Steiner, and we'll also then have plenty of time for questions, which will be preceded by a presentation of the summary for policymakers by Thomas Stocker, co-chair of Working Group 1. Before we start the statements on the podium, we'd like to bring you a message from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Distinguished members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, Chairperson of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to send my best wishes and gratitude to the IPCC. The world's eyes are on Stockholm today, awaiting your latest report. Since 1990, the IPCC has provided regular, unbiased assessment of the mounting impacts of a warming planet. You are the world's authorities on capitalism, recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize. You have used the world's best science to address the world's biggest challenge. This new report will be essential for governments as they work to finalize an ambitious legal agreement on capitalism in 2015. To add momentum to this process, I will convene a climate summit in September 2014 for leaders at the highest level from government, business, finance, civil society, and academia. The goal is to generate the political commitment to keep global temperature rise below the agreed 2 degrees Celsius threshold. We need to build resilience and seize the opportunities of a low-carbon future. Thanks to the dedicated work of a global community of scientists, supported and endorsed by the world's governments, we know the nature of the problem and the options for addressing it. The heat is on. Now we must act. Thank you for your work.
I'd now like to invite Monsieur Michel Jarraud, the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pachauri, Chair of IPCC, Professor Stocker and Chindai, co-chairs and distinguished members of the media. Well, we have gone a long way since 1988, 25 years ago, when IPCC was created by UNEP and WMO. We've gone a long way in our knowledge of the capital system, and we've gone a long way in our understanding of the various interaction and where do we stand. And we've gone a long way in understanding the human role in capitalism. WMO is very proud to have co-sponsored IPCC together with UNEP since this period. And as the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, said, this report will be essential to the discussion, to the negotiation, which will culminate in a climate agreement in 2015. And beyond that, it will also be the basis for policymakers, decision makers, to make decisions over the years to come. Now, an assessment is based on science to be assessed. And this science is based on a number of, on many multiple observation, research program, and WMO is very, very proud that through the work of the National Met Services and co-sponsored programs such as the World Climate Research Program, the Global Climate Observing System, it has provided major inputs into the work of this Working Group 1 report. Now, this report confirms, and you'll hear a lot more about it with even more certainty than in the past, that it is extremely likely that changes in our climate system for the past half a century are due to human influence. And it should serve as yet another wake-up call that our activities today will have a profound impact on society, not only for us, but for many generations to come. Multiple lines of evidence confirm that the extra heat being trapped by the greenhouse gases is indeed warming the Earth's atmosphere, the Earth's surface, the oceans, raising sea levels, melting ice caps, glaciers. But we are also changing, and this is of particular concern to my organization, a change in weather patterns and extreme events such as heat waves, droughts, floods. And that was highlighted in the recent WMO report on the global climate for the last for the decade 2001 to 2010. The Working Group 1 report provides new insight into the possible future occurrences of these events that we are now witnessing on a regular basis. Many of the extremes of the last decade were unprecedented, and the report highlights which ones are likely to become even more frequent. The decade 2001-2010 was the warmest on record, continuing the trend of global warming. More temperature records were broken than in any other previous decade. Of course, and that is discussed in great detail in the report, the rate of increase would have been even higher if it was not for the relative cooling influence of La Niña event and the role of deep ocean in absorbing the heat. So the IPC report demonstrates that we must greatly reduce global emissions in order to avoid the worst effects of capitalism. But the report reflects how much our scientific knowledge has advanced since the previous report 6 years ago. This is knowledge that can be used, that should be used to produce actionable climate information and services to help society. And as many of you know, the United Nations system has embarked on a major initiative to develop capital services which will help decision makers in all sectors affected by climate change, and virtually it is almost every socio-economic sector, to have available information to make informed decision. This is the development of a global framework for climate services, and certainly it's something which will help decision making. But despite this really overwhelming scientific consensus around capitalism, we need further assessment, we need further projection, in particular to downscale this information at the regional and more local level. So we should not stop our investment in that. This is essential investment for the future generation. So this certainly reaffirms the importance and the need for IPCC. So Chairman and Co-Chair, really, WMO, as I said in Matters, is very proud to have sponsored that, but at the same time, we are looking to your contribution also in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel. I'd now like to invite Achim Steiner, Executive Director of UNEP, to speak from Nairobi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri, distinguished co-chairs, dear Michel, and representatives of the world media. I'm grateful to join you by means of this video conference. As you can appreciate, we would very much have liked to be with you today in Stockholm, but with the events in Nairobi, our place is here at the moment, and I'm grateful that we can, at least through this video link, provide just a couple of thoughts that echo already what my colleague Michel Jarreau has said. As the two institutions that have been the companions to the IPCC for well over 2 decades, we are extremely grateful that today we come back to the world community with yet another iteration of what I would call humanity's or our scientific journey of discovery about our planet's life support systems, and in particular the impact of human activity on the atmosphere, and by extension, as we have learned over time, also on the biosphere. The physical science basis has, from the beginning, been an extremely important element of allowing nations from all corners of the world, but also economic interests, social interests, to gather around a common set of understandings. Even today, in the year 2013, however, it cannot be the yardstick of the IPCC, the yardstick of an elusive quest for perfect knowledge. And I think it is always a tribute to the IPCC that it has found a means of expressing both what is certainty and what is uncertainty, and to what degree knowledge allows us to draw conclusions. The report, as it is presented this morning in the policymaker summary, is once again a very dramatic reminder of both the significance, the pace, and also our ability to increasingly understand what is happening to our planet. You say on page 3, warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. You say on page 7, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have increased to levels unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. And you take another step towards even greater certainty of probability when you talk about the human influence in driving these changes by saying that the evidence for human influence has grown since AR4. It is now deemed extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. There will be those, and this is also not inappropriate, that will focus on the question marks in a report. As I said before, for humanity to take decisions, perfect knowledge can never be the condition. The question is whether in the assessment of the risks that are before us, and also the multiple benefits that have become ever more self-evident as nations have acted the threat of climate change, but have also addressed issues of pollution, of human health, of stability in our ecosystems. When you add all of this together, then I hope that the world will take from the IPCC's first report in this cycle, the AR5, a very clear message. You may not know everything, but you know enough in order to be able to assess both the risks of not acting and the many opportunities that actions provide. This is not about ideology, this is not about self-interest, this is about the common interest of the international community, the planet, and ultimately our economies and societies. We in the United Nations Environment Programme commend the IPCC for having retained the courage, despite some of the challenges over the years, to not step back from having to bring what we know, even when we do not know everything, and allowing ultimately us, as the public, as societies, as governments, as CEOs, companies, to take informed decisions. Thank you very much, and Roby.
Thank you very much, Achim. I'd now like to invite Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, the chair of the IPCC, to say a few words.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be present here at the launch of the first of a series of reports that will constitute the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. I was chair when we completed the fourth assessment report, and may I tell our distinguished audience, we've come a long way. In the year 2010, the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and I requested the Inter-Academy Council, which is the apex body consisting of all the science bodies across the globe, to carry out a detailed assessment of IPCC's processes and procedures. They came up with an excellent report, and the governments of the world, who are essentially members of the IPCC and constitute the panel, deliberated on all the recommendations and implemented each one of them fully, except for one which had certain procedural problems associated with it. I'm particularly happy that something that I, in my first term, had introduced on an informal basis, that being the constitution of what we call the executive team or the E-team, has been formalized through the recommendations of the Inter-Academy Council. And I'm very happy to say that the complex undertaking that IPCC is now has the benefit of teamwork at the top, and we meet regularly. All decisions are taken collectively, and I think this, apart from several other measures that have been implemented, has strengthened the IPCC substantially. Now, as far as this particular report is concerned, let me just give you an overview of the kind of response we got from the scientific community when we sought nominations for authors to work on the fifth assessment report. We got close to 3,000 nominations. Now, this, may I say, was well over 50% more than what we had got in the fourth assessment report. And we were able to select 831 excellent professionals as authors and review editors. And as far as the newness or the freshness of talent is concerned, I'm happy to inform you that almost 60% of the authors in this assessment are new to the IPCC. So they bring in fresh perspectives, they bring in new knowledge. And to give you an example of how we have been able to harness new knowledge, if you look at the Working Group 1 report, I and Dr. Thomas Stocker and Dr. Chindahe will elaborate on this. We carried out a citation of 9,200 scientific publications, and roughly 2/3 of these have been published after 2007. So therefore, there's been a wealth of new knowledge which has been published, and all of that has been taken on board by the Working Group 1 report. I also want to mention that they got a total of 54,677 comments. As you know, the IPCC follows a very rigorous review process throughout its drafting activities. And this was provided by 1,089 expert reviewers drawn from 55 countries. So it's a very large scientific undertaking. And I want to tell you that some of the findings of this report go far beyond what we were able to provide in the fourth assessment report. And that's largely because there is a substantial amount of new knowledge. And of course, I want to pay the highest tribute to the scientists who have worked on this report. They've worked extremely hard, and symbolic of that is what we have been through in the last 4 days. We have worked 2 nights, fairly late at night, and this morning, of course, we finished well on time, but that also clearly indicates the quality of leadership, the extent of cooperative and collaborative spirit that existed among the authors, because this is a very, very good report that has come out, and we believe that the public, decision makers, the scientific community, and of course the average person on the street would be able to make use of this report effectively. Now, the co-chairs of Working Group 1 will tell you more about the details of the report, but I just want to pick up 1 or 2 items. One of them was quoted by Dr. Achim Steiner: warming of the capital system is unequivocal. This is something we said in the fourth assessment report, but here we've also said that since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished. Sea level has risen, and the concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased. So this, I think, is a succinct summary of what we are doing to the system that really determines the climate of this planet. I also want to highlight the fact that each of the last three decades has been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. And this is something that Dr. Michel Géraud has talked about when he mentioned the decade 2001 onwards having been the hottest, the warmest that we have seen. So I'm not going into the details of the report that will be provided by my distinguished colleagues, the co-chairs of Working Group 1 And of course, we'll have ample opportunity through the questions that you ask to be able to give you substantial information on the contents of the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pachi. I'd like to now ask Qin Dahe, co-chair of IPCC Working Group 1, to say a few words about the report.
尊敬的米歇尔·想入世界气象组织秘书长，尊敬的 Pachauri 先生 ，IPCC 主席，女士们、先生们，新闻界的朋友们，大家早上好。作为中国人，我今天能够在斯德哥尔摩和各位朋友见面，感到非常高兴。所以我的谈话呢是用中文来讲的。我之所以感到高兴，是因为
of last century, the environment of our planet deteriorates. In 1972, in Sweden, we have the first World Environment Conference to change a lot of the landscape of the world and have a lot of positive impact on the world, and including China. And in 1973, Chinese government established a ministry to protect the environment. And it's a very important department of the cabinet of the State Council of the Central Government of China. And the Environment Protection Conference in Stockholm in 1972 protect our environment, also protect our capital system. So what's the relations between environment and the capital system? Protecting environment is to protect the world we are now living. And to protect our capitalism system from the perspective of IPCC is try to protect the whole climate system in which our human activities rely on. So environmental protection is the climate system protection is very important component of environmental protection. With climate change, higher sea level, and disorder, water cycling, and some food safety issues, and also cryosphere and glacier, ice sheet, Greenland glacier, and high latitude permafrost are facing with many, many problems, and also the health of people are damaged because of these reasons. With that background, people around the world are discussing how can we protect our capital system. IPCC to make assessment on basis of physical science is very important component of our human race endeavor. United Nations attach great importance to this effort. WMO, we passed GFCS on the service, and Michel Chanru is dedicated to promote this GFCS, this convention, which is very important, and he contributed greatly to this effort. I myself working in IPCC for 18 years, and in my personal experience, IPCC is a big university. IPCC is very much like a big campus, and we have 259 authors, scientists from 39 countries participating in the drafting of this report from different countries, from developing countries, developed countries, and emerging economies. And according to my personal experience, take China as an example. In the third assessment report of IPC for Working Group 1, there's only 4 or 5 scientists from China. For the assessment report 4, we have 9 scientists from China to participate in drafting of the report. And for this assessment 5, the first working group, with the leadership of Thomas, my co-chair, now we have 17 Chinese scientists, if including me, 18 scientists from China. Why I share with you this data? IPCC attached great importance to the participation of scientists from developing countries. So China's participation, most of them are young scientists from China with 5 years experience. Many of them has become expert on protecting our climate change and a key person in protecting the environment of our world. So IPCC make great contribution not only from its own business, but make great contribution to the assistance to the developing countries. So I don't want to take up more time. The first working group with the great leadership of Thomas, of course with me, and we have working very hard in past 5 years. And Thomas will share with you more detailed introduction of the report. And in the past 4 days, we are working very hard. And we finish our review and adoption of summary for policymakers in early 5 o'clock in this morning. And we have the 36th plenary session of IPCC, which has approved our report, the summary for the policymakers. And we have this conference, press conference at 10 o'clock. So we are so honored that in this city, Stockholm, with a great tradition and honor of protecting our planet, to complete our mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dahe. And now Thomas Stocker, the co-chair of IPCC Working Group 1, will present the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 1 report that was completed earlier today.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Could I have the presentation, please? Thank you. Let's see whether that works. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to sit here.
Capitalism.
Change is the greatest challenge of our time. That says the Cancun Agreement, which the governments have adopted in 2010. And that is the reason why my colleagues, Dahe and I, have worked in the past 52 hours almost incessantly. We have slept only 6 hours in that time. So you may excuse if once in a while perhaps my voice is a bit slower as normally, but I think my colleagues can confirm that during the deliberations to arrive at this consensus over the 4 days, my voice has not faltered.
To limit the
2013, the physical science basis is the first of 3 assessment reports which will be published in the coming couple of months, and the cycle will close with a synthesis report that will be published in November 2014. In 2009, Working Group 1 has produced an outline of content scientists together with governments that was approved. It was like a task that was given to the scientists of the world. Please tell us what you know about observed
capitalism.
Give us evidence for the
Cataclysm
and its causes, and estimate how
capital
will change in the coming 50 to 100 years. And if I say
capitalism,
we are tasked to look at all aspects of
capitalism.
Not only the warming, which is so evident to everybody, but more importantly also changes in the water cycle, changes in sea level, changes in other quantities, the cryosphere, ice on this planet, and so forth. This task was given to the scientists. 259 authors were selected in 2010 and sent on a voyage together. Dahe has mentioned IPCC is a university. We have collaborated in a good spirit, in an engaged spirit, and that spirit of Working Group 1 was the essence of the success that we today are able to deliver this report. This report consists of over 1 million words, over 1,250 scientific diagrams. And Dr. Pachauri has mentioned this report digests 9,200 reviewed papers. So you may wonder, why is this useful for policymakers? You will see. This report is a report that has undergone thorough review. 54,677 review comments have been processed with the help of the technical support unit, a small amount of dedicated staff hosted by the University of Bern in Switzerland. Together with the authors, have they digested all these comments which were brought forward by a range of scientists and by the interested public from all places of the world. Also, the governments have participated actively in this review. We present our assessment in 14 chapters, and a new ingredient, unprecedented in this report, is an atlas of regional and global climate change projections, data that is numerically available, free of charge to anybody around the world to analyze the impacts that climate change will have in the next 50 to 100 years. We hope with this effort, collectively created by a few scientists relative to the scientific community of the world, that this will be useful to a wide range of the public. Of course, our task here in Stockholm was to condense this large report into a summary for policymakers, about 13,000 words.
Capitalism.
During the 4 days, the 110 governments have looked at every single word, at every number that is in this report, and I'm
Cataclysm.
say that we had to receive comments for almost all words of this report, sometimes more than one comment. Sometimes paragraphs were discussed over an hour. What I'm most proud of in this report, that we have gone yet another step towards condensing our messages. For the first time, we give 18 headline messages on less than 2 printed pages in simple, understandable language. What we observe, understand, and estimate about future
Capitalism.
I think this is an achievement, and a special point in this achievement is, of course, that 110 governments have found consensus over 18 short headlines. This is the first report of the 5th assessment report cycle contributed by Working Group 1. It has been mentioned already. Our assessment informs about changes in temperature over the past 150 years, and I show you here one of the many figures in the summary for policymakers and the underlying report that shows very clearly that the warming in this
Capitalist
system is indeed unequivocal. Each of the last 3 decades that you see at the right end of this graph has been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. And it is the ingredient of saying it's not just one decade that is warmer, but a succession of multiple decades that provide us with a robust signal of a changing planet. In the Northern Hemisphere, 1983 to 2012 was likely the warmest 30-year period of the last 1,400 years. This is a time perspective that we can access, not with high confidence, but with medium confidence, which is an important result by itself. You see here also how nuanced the language of IPCC is. We do not go for headlines, but we make scientific assessments. This is the face of the surface of our planet if you look at temperature. It is red. The world has been warming. The trend that you see is clearly given as colors of red, but we are also quite open to say that not in all locations of this planet we are able to make a robust assessment. These are the areas where you see no color. It is unfortunate that measurement systems do not yet permit a comprehensive and full global coverage, not only about temperature, but also about on important variables such as precipitation. We wanted to make a point in this assessment that this is an assessment of a string of assessment that has started in 1990, and we have reconfirmed after a very careful scientific assessment that the warming in the capitalist system is unequivocal, a conclusion that has been drawn in the fourth assessment report, now based on many more multiple lines of independent evidence from all
Capitalism.
System components, that is from the atmosphere, the ocean, the ice, and the land. Here you see two time series of temperature and a new quantity that has received quite some attention in this report. On the right side, it's the ocean heat content. With the warming of the atmosphere, all ingredients of the capital are changing. In particular, the ocean is taking up most of the energy. The scientists have concluded that indeed over 93% of the additional energy is stored in the ocean. That doesn't mean that the ocean saves us from
Capitalism.
It means that there would be much more powerful warming did we not have the ocean. This is displayed very clearly on the right-hand side. These two figures, however, convey another important message. You see the red band and the blue band. These are model simulation carried out by the best models of many centers around the world. If these models are forced with natural variability and with our best knowledge of forcing without greenhouse gases, the temperature variations are fairly regular over the last 100 years. However, the increase in greenhouse gases to level today unprecedented for CO2 over the last 800,000 years lead to a warming. The black curve that you see are the observations. The warming explains what we observe, the increase caused by greenhouse gases. That has led to this statement, a very simple statement. One of the 18 key messages that the 110 governments that were present in this room for 4 days have adopted in consensus. Human influence on the capitalist system is clear. Let us now take a very coarse look into the future. You see here a complex diagram. There is a lot of data of model simulations, numerical results that flow into this diagram that show that the future of the world, here depicted as the evolution of temperature, is quite different depending on our choices. IPCC has considered 4 emission scenarios. You see these 4 scenarios depicted to the right. in terms of their temperature ranges. The warming is clear. In the future, warming will continue under every scenario that is available. We have found in our assessment, analyzing these model simulation, that global surface temperature change for the end of the 21st century is likely to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to 1850 for all scenarios. This is again a statement that is adopted by the governments of the world, which at the same time, in a different process, take a great interest in this temperature 1.5 degrees Celsius. We therefore deliver out of this report a clear policy-relevant message. Another parameter or variable that has been very carefully assessed during this assessment report is sea level. We have had a dedicated chapter to look very carefully into issues of sea level rise, its causes, the observed sea level rise, and most importantly, projections of future sea level rise in response to the warming that will occur in the current 21st century. You see that these curves go up. Of course, it depends on the scenario. In other words, on our choices today, whether sea level rise by 2050 will be 24 centimeters for the best estimate of the lowest scenario, or 0.3 centimeters for the best estimate of the highest scenario, or higher value at the end of the 21st century of 40 centimeters or 63 centimeters until the year 2100. This figure, together with the temperature changes and the precipitation changes, clearly demonstrates that
Capitalism
challenges the two primary resources of humans and ecosystems, land and water. In short, it threatens our planet, our only home. This is a figure that, after many hours of deliberation and preparation by the scientists, has been adopted through the governmental process of IPCC. It shows on the horizontal axis the cumulative emissions since 1850. In other words, the total of carbon dioxide emissions by humans through the combustion of fossil fuel, cement production and deforestation, and other land use changes. You see on the vertical temperature anomaly relative to the late 19th century, and the graph clearly indicates a linear relationship between these two quantities, warming and cumulative carbon emissions. The higher the cumulative carbon emissions are, the warmer it gets. And the key message here is that it doesn't so much depend on the scenario. You see these scenarios all fall on one line. We have concluded that in order to limit
capitalism,
it will require substantial and sustained reduction of greenhouse gas emission. Another key statement that results from our assessment and our report that we have assembled here and concluded in the past 4 days in Stockholm. With that, I would like to close and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'd now like to invite questions, both from the room and also from people following this press conference by webcast. And you can email your questions to us to ipcc-questions@wmo.int. if you're asking a question, if you're asking a question, please state your name and your media, and also please state whether your question is directed at anyone particular on the podium. This is a press conference, so we're inviting the media to ask questions, not other people. So do we have any questions? Over there.
Thank you. Richard Ingham from the news agency Agence France Presse. This is a question for Dr. Pachauri. Does this report silence what climate skeptics have said? Does it restore, do you think, some of the credibility which the IPCC may have lost after the episodes of which followed Copenhagen?
Well, our essential job is to carry out an assessment of the science. We have done that as faithfully and to the best of our abilities. Now, what impact that has on the public and on any actions that are taken by governments or society at large is really not for us to comment on. But I think, as the presentation from Dr. Thomas Stocker has clearly brought out, there is a need for us to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases substantially if we really want to stabilize the Earth's
Capitalist.
And I hope this is a message that the world will receive and accept. And on the question of the credibility of the IPCC, may I say that the fourth assessment report was overall an excellent report, but what we have now goes several steps beyond that, simply because we have a wealth of new information and knowledge. And secondly, we have worked much harder, we have worked far more carefully, and I hope to that extent what we have produced is also an excellent document.
Thank you. A question from Roger, please.
Roger Harrigan, BBC News. A question for Dr. Stocker. Your climate change models did not predict a recent slowdown in warming. How can we be sure about your projections for future warming?
Thank you very much. The question was, how can we be sure about our predictions over longer terms if the
Capital
models apparently are not able to predict or anticipate what is referred to recently as the so-called warming hiatus? This is a question that the scientists have looked at very carefully based on the published literature. I'm afraid to say there is not a lot of published literature that allows us to delve deeper at the required depth of this emerging scientific question. For example, there are not sufficient observations of the uptake of heat, particularly into the deep ocean. That would be one of the possible mechanisms to explain this warming hiatus. Likewise, we have insufficient data to adequately assess the forcing over the last 10 years or 15 years to establish a relationship between the causes of the warming. The assessment has shown, and this is something that scientists have known for a long time, that there is a large amount of natural variability. And the shorter the time period is over which you determine trends, in fact, an old rule says that
capitalism
relevant trends should not be calculated for periods of less than around 30 years, that these periods are less relevant for the projection of changes in the future. So in short, these models do simulate natural variability, but it was concluded that the state of the system at the beginning of simulations that would be required to simulate precisely phases of lesser warming than a long-term trend is not sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. The lady in the front row, please.
So I'm Karin Boyce, writing for Swedish daily Dagens Nyheter.
Your microphone isn't on. Could you?
Okay.
That's it.
So I'm Karin Boyce, writing for Swedish daily Dagens Nyheter. It's clear from your report today that those who are children today, when they are old, they will live in a warmer world. And this world could be about 1 degree warmer, according to your more lowest scenarios, compared to pre-industrial conditions. It could be as warm as 6 degrees warmer. So my question is, given the current emissions that exist in reality now, what scenarios are most close to reality?
I think that's a question for Thomas, yes.
At the moment, we are faring at higher scenarios than are assessed and are available in these simulations. But of course, the path of a scenario is dependent on the emissions of greenhouse gases every year, and therefore humankind has a choice on which scenario we will fare in the coming 100 years or so. So it depends crucially how much carbon dioxide will be emitted in the future, and I have pointed out that a good approximation of the warming that is ahead of us is produced by the total amount of carbon that we have emitted since pre-industrial times.
Thank you. I'd like to take a question from outside the room now. This is from Roseanne Skerbley of Voice of America. And I think it's for Thomas and possibly Patry as well. How does AR5 better inform the ongoing climate negotiations for a global capital treaty?
In this report, we have available a large number of model simulations. Unfortunately, the scenarios, as they were defined several years ago, were not defined with the goal of informing precisely about warming targets that are now being discussed in the policymaker community. Nevertheless, in our assessment, we could make statements about the likelihood that certain temperatures, like 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, would be exceeded by the end of the 21st century.
Yes, please.
Well, I think I must inform this audience that we will be making presentations on this report, and of course, a lot of knowledge and information that's available in the fourth assessment report, which, may I say, is still highly valid, at the Conference of the Parties that's to be held in Warsaw in a few weeks' time. May I also say that in the entire process of coming out with the Working Group 2 report and the Working Group 3 report, culminating with the synthesis report, we are going to make a major effort in terms of spreading the message, the findings of our report, because as the IAC review told us, and as we ourselves have felt for quite some time, the IPCC has to do a lot more in terms of outreach, and we're attempting to do that. So I hope this will inform the public, decision makers, negotiators, and heads of government.
Thank you. Fiona?
Hello, Fiona Harvey from The Guardian. Just on the question of, and I'd like to direct this at Dr. Pachauri and Dr. Stocker, on the question of carbon budgets, and we've emitted, I think 530 gigatons, you say, so far, and we can emit 880 at most to stay within 2 degrees. That has a clear implication, does it not, that we cannot burn all of our fossil fuel reserves. Could you address that, please? How can we stop that from happening?
Well, one of the things that we had said in the fourth assessment report, as you might remember, Fiona, was the fact that an extremely effective instrument would be to place a price on carbon. Because I think if we have to come up with solutions, then to some extent, regulation, informing the public would make a lot of difference. But in the ultimate analysis, I think it's only through the market that we might be able to get a large enough and a rapid enough response. So I hope once we have finished work on the 3 working group reports and the synthesis report, we would have evaluated some of the instruments and mechanisms by which we can bring about rapid reduction in the emissions of greenhouse gases. But that's something that the IPCC cannot advocate. The IPCC can only place the facts before the public, and I think it's for decision makers to see what's required in the light of the scientific evidence that we provide.
Yeah. Michelle, please.
Yeah. Actually, I would like to come back to the previous question as well. This question on how will it inform the negotiations and the COP process? Because what you can see from this report, the 4 scenarios which are highlighted in the report, and it leads to this band of temperature increase, and some people have started to argue that the lower part of the increase is such that maybe we have time. No, actually it's quite the opposite. It's quite the opposite, because the low band comes only if very quick and aggressive action is taken. If no action is taken, no way you will be in the lower band. You remember the graph showed by Thomas Stocker. You will be in the upper band. So that is a very important information for the negotiator. If we don't take action quickly now, we're not talking about the first scenario. We're talking about the other scenario. The other thing is that often people focus on temperature, which is very important. But please do keep in mind that the temperature increase, one, will not be uniform. You have seen the map shown by Thomas Stocker about there are very different colors in different parts of the planet. But second, one of the biggest impact of
capitalism
is on the water cycle. I'm just back this morning from New York, where there was General Assembly, many debate on the future of water resources, management of water resources. This will be one of the biggest impact. And back to your question about our children, our grandchildren, the children born now, definitely they will be living at the end of this century, and they will see they will see probably the last part of the graphic. So yes, decision we take, we have a huge responsibility for our children and grandchildren.
Jesper Tejlgaard, Danish National TV. You are saying in the paper that to reduce the temperature rise, it will require substantial and sustained reductions, but you have said no numbers. Have you made any calculations compared to the 2007 report, how to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees? In 2007 you said 400 ppm as much, and peaking in 2015.
Certainly at the level of this summary for policymakers, we did not communicate specific numbers when and how these emissions have to be reduced, but we give very relevant guidance in terms of the total amount of carbon that that cannot be exceeded in terms of emission in order to stay below, say, for example, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. These values need to be taken in the context of the carbon emitted already up to now, and we know that, for example, to stay likely below 2 degrees Celsius, another target that is negotiated or discussed at the level of the UNFCCC, we cannot emit more than 1,000 billion tons of carbon, of which already 54% have been emitted. So this is a very clear indication, but whether this path of keeping the warming under a target of 2 degrees is actually a rapid reduction or waiting. That is not determined in this report. This is purely a choice of the emitters of carbon dioxide from now on and in the future.
I just want to clarify that these are issues that will come out of the Working Group 3 report, where we're going to look at mitigation strategies. And I'm very happy to see that you remember the figure of 2015, which we had come up with in the AR4 as what would be required if we want to stabilize temperature increase to between 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius at least cost. Now, of course, you can delay that, but costs will go up, impacts will get worse, and these are issues that certainly we'll be in a better position to look at once the Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports come out.
Thank you. I have another question from outside the room. This is from Magdalena Muir of Coastal and Marine News. One important issue in understanding
capitalism
impacts is the downscaling of global models to the regional level and the integration of ice, snow and water in the global hydrological cycle. Please describe the linkages between the changing ice cover and thickness in the Arctic and the greater precipitation in northern Europe, and less and varying precipitation in southern Europe and the Mediterranean region.
That sounds like an exam question. It's very clear that we are living in a coupled system, so the emission of greenhouse gases leads to warming. The warming itself causes melting of ice in all regions of the world, foremost the glaciers, but also the Arctic. We see in the Arctic unprecedented trends of the melting, and we are not talking about individual years, but we are talking about a long-term trend over several years, over the last 30 years, which are very clearly directing our attention to an ice cover that in the future will be significantly reduced from today. One particular question, for example, the scientists have assessed is the question of an ice-free Arctic in summer.
Thank you. At the back of that, yes. No, you.
Jürgen Detlefsen, German television ARD. I want to tell you a bit about the findings and prognoses for Central Europe, for example, for Germany, and with regard to the measures that must be taken. What do you think the planned German energy change away from fossil and nuclear energy to alternative energies will make differences? Thank you.
This is clearly not a topic that we have considered in our assessment report. It was not our task to look at that. These are questions that both in terms of the impact Working Group 2, which will release their report in March next year, and Working Group 3 in terms of energy pathways for the future will assess very carefully. Our view has been a rather global view, the basis, the physical science basis of
capitalism.
David Rose from the UK's Mail on Sunday. I'd like to ask you two questions.
I asked Jeff, your neighbour, too. Sorry. Go ahead.
First of all, you defend the simulations, saying that they should not be expected to reproduce internal variability on a decadal scale. I'd like to ask, number one, how much longer will the so-called pause or hiatus have to continue before you would begin to reflect that there is something fundamentally wrong with the models? My second question is that in AR4, you gave a likeliest figure for the equilibrium climate sensitivity of 3.0 degrees. You've not given a likeliest figure this time. Do you consider that the likeliest figure is now below 3.0 degrees Celsius?
Well, first of all, I should say that these
Capital
models have shown remarkable agreement with the longer-term trends that are observed and that I have shown over the last 100 years. And this gives us confidence, together with other changes that are simulated in these models and at the same time observed in the
Capital
system, like, for example, the reduction in ice or the uptake of heat in the ocean. These are the kind of variables on which we build confidence in these models. There is an entire chapter in our assessment that concludes that models have improved in their performance, that they compare better in many variables. But of course, such a comparison is much more comprehensive than just looking at the last 10 years. I should also say that it very much depends which of the last 10 or 15 years you would actually pick for a model comparison. And we are very clear in our report that it is inappropriate to compare a short-term period of observations with model performance. Regarding equilibrium
Capital
sensitivity that you ask, we have now available a much more extended assessment of
Capital
sensitivity, which is based on more observations and on longer records. The recent studies have been taken on board by the body that assessed this question of
Capital
sensitivity, and they have concluded that they have higher confidence in making a statement about extreme estimates of
Capital
sensitivity, such as higher than 6 degrees Celsius, and other extremes on the low end, which are extremely unlikely to be below 1 degree Celsius. But it's correct that this assessment has not declared a best estimate because of the studies, both from models and observational-based studies, do not coincide.
So with respect, you've not answered my first question. How much longer would the hiatus have to continue? Never mind what the start date is. The start date is when it is. How much longer would it have to continue before it would cause you to consider that the models may be flawed?
I may not be able here to give you a number. Certainly, if we experience for the next 20 years constant temperature, I would say with great confidence that this is not an option given the emissions of greenhouse gases that we measure every year at levels unprecedented, record emissions, and the relationship between warming and these emissions of greenhouse gases is a very robust one. But it is clear there are phases of natural variability. For example, if we have a large volcanic eruption next year or a couple of years from here, then we would expect, of course, cooling.
Yeah, maybe I would like to deal with your question different way. From a scientific point of view, your question is what we would call an ill-posed question. And it is based on somewhat misunderstanding on how the model work. Let me give you a few steps to explain what I mean. In this room, the air molecules, keep on bumping in each other. This is what we call Brownian movement. This movement is essentially unpredictable. However, it doesn't mean that because of that we cannot predict what the weather will be over the next few hours, over the next few days. And actually it's done with remarkable accuracy. Now let's go one step further. It is impossible, and it will always be impossible, to predict 1 year in advance whether there will be a thunderstorm in a given place. However, it is possible to predict trends and to predict evolution, anomalies over larger scale. Let's go one step further. It's not because we cannot predict these things 1 year in advance that we cannot predict the evolution of the climate, which is based on interaction between a number of elements, like the ocean, like the atmosphere, like the cryosphere, like the land surface. And the model, as you would say in UK, the proof of the pudding is to a large extent in the eating of the pudding. And these models are proving more and more remarkable at predicting the large-scale trend, the longer-term trends. But it would be, back to my ill-posed question issue, it would be wrong to judge a model on the ability to predict some individual event in this natural or in this variability, not only natural, in this variability. So therefore, it is you should distinguish the ability of predicting the temperature, for example, for individual years 10 years in advance, from the ability to predict trends over 20, 30 years period. Back to an earlier question, indeed, it has been a recommendation from the World Meteorological Organization. When looking at climate issue, it is important to look at long trends. And indeed, as I think, Chairman, you mentioned that, the consensus is that one of the best time scale to look at that is 30 years time scale. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question there, please.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, Jeff.
My name is Zhonghua Liu. I'm a journalist with the People's Daily. And I want to ask a question to Mr. Qin Dahe. I ask it in English, in Chinese.
Mr. Qin Dahe, I'm from China Daily, People's Daily. There are several questions. The first, this assessment report, what's its influence on the climate change negotiation, which will take place next month for developing country? Do you think this assessment report will have impact on their position? And secondly, you mentioned what is anything you want to say to the audience from China and on their consumption model or pattern? What is the influence of this report on consumption pattern of Chinese people? And then I use Chinese to answer your question. Thank you very much for your questions. IPCC is an organization to study on science of
capitalism
and the
capitalism
and its relations with emission reduction. So we have 3 working groups. So Dr. Thomas and I, as co-chairs, are chairing the first working group. So our target is the physical science basis of
capitalism.
It's very technical. It's very interesting, but it's also very challenging. We have questions from many friends of the media around the world when we can have a very accurate short-term forecast. And so we have a lot of explanations on these technical issues. So assessment report 5 is actually a very important report and making a lot of progress in understanding of the physical science basis of
capitalism.
However, for the climate change negotiation, it is not part of the mission of IPCC. So like some climate change economics,
capitalism,
climate change related energy issues is not part of the job of our working group. But we will have some science implication and a guiding significance. For instance, on the accumulative carbon emission, we have a best guess or a best estimation. And I think it will have some impact on Working Group 3. And Working Group 3 will have a very direct impact on political negotiation of the Framework Convention of Climate Change of the United Nations. And second question, what's the impact of our work of the Working Group 1 for Chinese consumption pattern, for example. We are studying on the scientific issues of
capitalism.
Climate change science is a study on 5 spheres, the atmosphere and the water sphere, and the surface of rocks, and the cryosphere, and also biosphere. And it's a very, very comprehensive study of all the 5 spheres of our planet, of the system. And in developed countries, in developing countries, many scientists are working on this. IPCC Working Group 1 is the review of their work so that we can come up with a summary or a report on the contribution and the result of research and study of all these scientists from different parts of the world. And so science is the essence of this working group. And it will not be only be used by scientists, but it can also be used by statesmen and consumers and the public. China is a very big country with 1.3 billion population. And China's ecosystem is very vulnerable. China's economic growth in the past 3 to 4 decades developing so rapidly. So actually, this science basis, physical science basis report has a big impact on China's way of life for Chinese people, like the green style of life. If every Chinese, like United States of America, one family has 3 cars or more cars, it will be a disaster for China and also for the world. So I think it will very big impact on the lifestyle of Chinese people. If China can mind its business well, it will be a very great contribution to the world. If China can protect our own
capitalist
system and our own environment, it will itself a very great contribution to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to take a question from outside the room, please. This is from Charles Côté of La Presse in Montreal. Have you rejected higher or faster sea level rise predictions, and if so, why?
I didn't understand the first word, what you said.
Have you rejected higher or faster sea level rise predictions?
Higher sea level rise is a question that was carefully assessed in a separate chapter, in a chapter of our assessment report. The scientists have looked at all the available published literature, and they have concluded that there is very low confidence in models that do not include the physical processes that are required to simulate faithfully sea level rise in response to warming. Therefore, there is no confidence in these higher levels. The panel has mentioned these studies, has transparently assessed them, but confidence was not assigned. It was also declared there is no consensus currently in the scientific community about these very high sea level projections over the next 100 years.
Thank you. Jeff?
Jeff Filene of the Daily Telegraph. I just want to follow up David Rose on climate sensitivity. I know you have not set a most likely figure, but you have reduced the lower bound of the equilibrium climate sensitivity and the upper bound, I think, of the transient climate response. How much extra time does that buy us? What does it actually mean in terms of effect on the climate?
This specific, albeit relevant question also for the policymakers has only recently been studied in the scientific community. There is not a lot of literature available, but I can tell you that it would be on the order of a few years only. So it is not really a relevant quantity when it comes to a sustainable reduction and substantial reduction of emissions that would be required to actually keep the temperature under a given warming limit.
Alex?
Alex Morales with Bloomberg News. My question's for Thomas Stocker. You acknowledged, I'm down here right in front of you. You acknowledged that a 15-year period is less relevant from looking at a
Capitalism
point of view, and that 30 years is what you would normally look at. If that's the case, why did you even mention a 15-year period in the summary for policymakers? And just a second question, if I may, because I wasn't clear in your answer to an earlier question on which of the 4 RCPs we're closest to at the moment. I thought you said we're above all of them, but does that mean we're above even 8.5 at the moment? Is that what we're tracking on?
Well, it's important to look at the longer term, at a longer period when we compare emissions, because there is also quite large variations. For example, the financial crisis has reduced emissions just for a year, where after that year one would have concluded that a correction has taken place, only to find that the year later these emissions have rebounded, if you wish. Could you repeat the first questions, please?
The first question.
I apologize. I have been up for
no, I understand.
52 hours with 6 hours of sleep. I say that publicly, and you probably see it in my face.
Just on the second question, does that mean at the moment we would appear to be above 8.5, but you can't really tell because of the financial crisis?
No, the financial crisis is a couple of years ago. I think the most relevant insight is not where we are now, but where we will be in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. And that depends on the decisions that we are taking today. So it is the choice that we have. It's not on the path that we are. The important point is that you keep on the part of the lower scenario, provided you have a declared goal to stay
capitalism
of 2.5 degrees Celsius. And currently what is very clear, we are not on that path that would lead us to respect that target or that warming target that is currently discussed in the policymaker community.
And the first question was why include a 15-year period in the summary for policymakers at all?
Yes, thank you very much. It is a very high standard of IPCC to be very transparent and to take on board also difficult scientific questions. It is clear that this question is an emerging scientific topic, very interesting for the scientists, but as I already mentioned, there are not many studies available that would enlighten us as to the causes of this relatively longer period. One must say, however, when one analyzes longer term periods, it's not such an unusual case. In particular, it is interesting to note that people always pick 1998 as the starting date of these trends. Of course, if you pick a special year like 1998, that is characterized by a very strong, actually the second strongest El Nino year in the 20th century, then of course that contributes to a trend that is different from the long-term multi-decadal or century timescale trend. That coinciding with a series of medium to low strength volcanic eruptions over the last five years or so, plus conditions that rather look like La Nina, which have a global impact, a weak global impact, we are just in a situation where it's like if you cast 3 dice and there is a chance that you have 3 faces of 6 or 3 faces of 1.
So, sorry, could I just, I'm still not clear on why you included it though. Is it because you were requested to include details about this and you felt it was something you needed to give a best explanation of? Or?
Not at all. In a time where information is generated at the fingertip, I think it is incumbent on the scientists who look at challenging and difficult questions. This is one, and if you want information about this that is objective, transparent, and comprehensive, then I would argue the source is IPCC, and neither blogs nor other products that are around. That is what you have to turn to seek clarification in this question. But I can I must say that this question will certainly also be looked at by the scientists in the coming years, because it's an interesting question, and as I said, it's an emerging scientific issue. It is not concluded with our assessment, but I think we have made an important first step to put some numbers on the table and also to communicate the uncertainties when analyses of such a short period of time are considered.
Yeah, Michel? Yeah, maybe to complement that, actually, as Thomas Stocker said, it is not unprecedented to have these things. It's part of the variability. But something that the IPC report, the fifth assessment report, has been doing more is to try to start going into the attribution of this variability, try to explain what they are due to. And it is certainly a very important aspect. But again, keep in mind that if you were to start, instead of looking at the period 98 to 2012, if you look at the period 99 to 2012, the trend is almost twice as big. So it shows the importance of this single year. That's why let's be careful not to interpret that in terms of trend, but very interesting work has been done by the assessment to try to understand the elements of this variability and to do a bit of attribution, which is a tricky issue. Now, by using the word trick, of course, it should not be interpreted in the way it was misinterpreted.
I just want to give you an example how we carry out our work. One of the key messages that we have conveyed is that the last 3 decades in succession were the warmest of the past 150 years. There was a long discussion in the scientific community, but also in our deliberations, whether we should not perhaps pick the last or the present decade, which indeed is the warmest one. IPCC has found a consensus that this is not the headline message we want to go for. We want to have a statistics of a number of such decades, 30 years, which provides a much more robust insight into this issue of trends and changes in trends on such short-term periods.
Thank you. At the back there, please.
So my name is Mikaela Lundell from Extract, which is a popular scientific publication at one of the Swedish research councils. And I'm interested in this new atlas of regional projections. There is a large demand of regional and even local projections from local policymakers. So I wonder, what is the resolution of these projections, and of what use can it be to local policymakers?
Well, if you ask what is the use to local policymakers, then there are many other informations apart from how capital evolves over the global continental scale, which was the focus of the model simulations, are required. So this atlas sets the context and the scene for precisely these local impact studies, and therefore it is a basis for them. But you would need a whole series of other scientific studies and methodologies to arrive at a fine scale, local scale information. For example, how water resources evolve, how precipitation changes in various seasons, or how extreme events, which are so important on the local scale, would evolve. But the atlas is an important starting point with a global perspective.
Thank you. I think, Dr. Pachauri, you have to leave us now, don't you? But I
just wanted to say something.
Yeah.
I also wanted to bring to your attention and remind you that, just 2 years ago, we brought out 2 special reports, one dealing with extreme events and disasters and how we might be able to advance adaptation to these. And the second one was on renewable energy sources and
capitalism
mitigation. Now, some of the broader questions that you're asking in terms of changes in
capital
go far beyond looking at merely temperature changes. So I wanted to just bring those 2 reports to your attention as well.
Thank you. Did Nairobi want to come in on that question as well?
No, we're fine right now, Jonathan. We're just enjoying listening to what's happening, but we'll certainly come in if there's something we want to comment on.
Okay, thank you. Polita?
Polita Clark from the Financial Times.
You need to put your microphone on, sorry.
Is that not on now? Sorry.
Speak closer to the microphone.
Close.
Sorry. Polita Clark from the Financial Times. There's obviously a lot of changes in the final summary that we've just seen compared to the final draft that you were working on at the beginning of the week. And although it hasn't been possible to go through the entire 36 pages this morning, it does seem as though there's been an attempt to put the slowdown in global warming, slowdown in warming over the last 15 years into the sort of context that Thomas Stocker has just been talking about. And I wondered if you could explain how and why that change was made. Thank you.
There was not made a change in terms of placement or messaging regarding this specific issue of
capitalism.
Of course, many changes, as you rightly pointed out, were made in terms of clarity, in terms of formulation of sentences. We scientists often tend to communicate in a language that is complicated and technical. And I can tell you in these 4 days, all of my colleagues present here in Stockholm, including Dahe and myself, were challenged on a really high level by the governments to tell in simple words what our assessment is. And I am extremely proud to say that we have kept the 18 key messages with which we have come in. We have convinced the policymakers that this is a consensus, a robust consensus, and we have also kept all the figures that were proposed to inform in a comprehensive way the policymakers, but also the wider public once this report is adopted. So, in summary, I can say I'm very proud because what we come out with has clearer and more understandable language, but the essence of it was not changed in any aspect whatsoever.
Thank you. There's a question at the back there, please. Yeah.
Navin Singh Khadka from the BBC World Service. This is basically about this, Mr. Stocker, you said 110 governments approved. What about the remaining governments? How would you incorporate their say? And how does it look like? I mean, do you think you'll be able to get the consensus from the remaining of the government?
I don't have the tally of the governments who attended on the top of my head. Was not concerned with looking at the governments who were there. It is a big room. I don't have the list. You should refer to the Secretariat.
Thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So one there, please. You need a microphone and your name, please. No, you have to switch the microphone on as well.
I'm sorry. My name is Rafael Garcia. I'm with Folha, a Brazilian newspaper. My question is for Dr. Thomas Stocker. The new report shows more pessimistic projections for sea level rise. Can scientists already tell how much they will vary regionally, and whether the regional variations we've seen so far will likely to be the same ones in the future?
Well, one of the important information is that, of course, superimposed or in addition to the global mean sea level rise, there is also an expression of regional sea level rise. But we can say with confidence that over 90% of the coastlines do experience and are exposed to the sea level rise, which is very well in line with the global mean sea level rise. What is also important for the communities around the ocean margin, if you wish, in coastal lines, are the occurrences of extreme high sea level rise, which superimposed on the rising sea level have greater impact. We did not look at the impact. That is not in the mandate of this working group. But what was looked at was at the occurrence of and the change in frequency and intensity of these high sea level events. And this is information that the scientists have collected in an unprecedentedly detailed overview of extreme events, not just high sea level, but also heat waves and other phenomena like heavy precipitation, etc., all comprehensively assessed in this report.
Thank you. Last question over there, please.
Another question to Dr. Stocker, keeping you from your well-deserved nap. From John Parker of The Economist. There's a question about the growing confidence that you express that in human responsibility for
capitalism.
Two of the themes of the report are equilibrium, climate sensitivity, and the role of the oceans, especially the deep oceans. As you've already said, you've widened the range of the capital sensitivity, which sort of seems to imply that there's a wider range of possibilities about the way the climate's responding to higher greenhouse gas concentrations. And on the oceans, you show very clearly that, as it were, more heat is going into the oceans, but as I understand it, we don't really know why that's the case, why, as it were, more is going into the oceans and into the surface air temperatures. So if we, don't know why the cap's responding quite as it is, and if we don't know why, there's this sort of shift away from rising air temperatures towards rising ocean temperatures, how can we be more certain than we used to be about the role of humans in capitalism?
Well, we are more certain because we have multiple lines of independent evidence and an increased understanding. But I believe you're confounding two different things here. You mentioned capital sensitivity. This is a metric in the capitalism system to assess long-term capitalism. That is in response to a doubling of carbon dioxide when the capital system comes into an equilibrium. And you have also mentioned, just almost in the same sentence, an increased uptake of heat into the deep ocean. This is one of the mechanisms that I have explained, a potential explanation for the pause in the warming, but these two issues need to be kept very carefully separate. They influence one another, but within our understanding that has been expressed in this report, we have consistency and confidence as to the understanding of the additional heat that is taken up by the ocean and by the capital system, the forcing that has caused it, and the temperature changes that we assess at the Earth's surface and in the ocean.
Thank you very much for your attention and for your questions. The press conference is now over. If you've requested interviews, you'll be met at the conference information desk, which is next to where you picked up your headphones, and escorted to the people you're interviewing. If you haven't requested interviews but would still like to, send an email to ipcc-interviews@wmo.int, and we'll see if we can fit those in. Thank you very much.